for March 16, 2017 order. Can I get a roll call for members, please?
Dirk Bowden.
Here.
Emery Dorsey. Here. Donna Kimsey.
Here.
Janet Leo.
Here.
Scott Ohm.
Here.
Vivian Voss.
Here.
Ellen Bucknam and Amanda Weaver are absent tonight.
The next order on the agenda is Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Is there a motion to approve the order of the agenda?
I move to approve the order of the agenda.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Call for vote.
Motion passed 6-0.
Is there a motion to approve the order of the minutes for March 2nd, 2017?
I make motion to approve the minutes of March 2nd, 2017.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Call for vote.
Motion passed 6-0.
There is no one in the audience, so they will not be, there's nothing else to, on tonight's agenda. Nobody signed up to speak, as there's nobody in the audience. So we will conclude the public forum and move to the public hearing. I open the public hearing for case number ZOA-17-01, an ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning the regulation of small-scale alcohol production facilities, and ask for the staff report.
Thank you. I'll give the staff report from the table for this one. I don't have any slides. But for the record, Lauren McLack with the Community Development Department. And I would like to enter into the record the case file, zoning code, and draft ordinance. So this code amendment is one that most of you, I think, saw in discussion in January. And it essentially addresses small-scale alcohol production, which, as you know, has been a growing industry in Colorado, but has not been addressed in the city's zoning code at all. And that silence has really created a lack of clarity for staff and for business owners over the last few years. So this is a pretty straightforward ordinance that would help bring our code more into contemporary compliance with industries that we see growing here in the Denver metro area. Essentially, we're creating new definitions for microbrewery, microdistillery, and micro winery. That micro designation is defined by the production volume of those facilities, and those volume thresholds we established consistent with state law and industry standards and with other communities. We also work closely with the city's clerk's office. You may remember that Robin was here. He's our deputy city clerk. That's the office that staffs the city's liquor license authority, so we know that our code amendment is consistent there. Along with the new definitions, we're updating the use charts. Again, no change since that discussion in January. Essentially, if a micro small-scale alcohol producer has a tap room or a tasting room, they would be permitted in all of our mixed-use and commercial zone districts. You would need a special use permit in our least intensive commercial zone districts, which are neighborhood and restricted commercial, so that's a discretionary review. If you don't have a tap room or tasting room, then you're essentially just a manufacturing use, so you'd be permitted in the industrial zone district and in the mixed-use interstate zone districts. Anything that exceeds those small-scale thresholds, we would consider to be just a standard industrial alcohol producer, so they'd be allowed in those industrial zone districts wherever manufacturing is allowed. For a point of reference, I didn't include this in the staff report, but I was looking it up this afternoon. So Riccoli was Wheat Ridge. It was the first craft brewer in Wheat Ridge, and their first year, I think they opened with 250 barrels per year. So really, really small, like nano-size brewery. The microbrewery threshold industry standard is 15,000. So we have plenty of room to accommodate those small-scale producers that we're seeing pop up in Wheat Ridge and elsewhere, and allow them room to grow. I believe right now the production volume system at Colorado Plus, just for reference, is a 1-barrel system. So I think they have plans to grow, but obviously they will be able to do that within the parameters of the ordinance that we're proposing tonight. So as I mentioned, it's the same approach that was discussed in January with very little change, and that's the end of my comments if you have any questions.
Do any of the commissioners have questions? Okay, there is no one in the audience, so I will close the citizens forum. And at this point, I would entertain a motion.
Okay. I make a motion to wherever it is here, recommend motion. I move to recommend the approval of the proposed ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning the regulation of small-scale alcohol production facilities with these exhibits. Proposed ordinance, which is what I was reading here.
Is there a second?
Second?
Any discussion? Call for a vote.
Motion carried 6-0.
Thank you. We will now move on to the second case. I open the public hearing for case number ZOA-17-02, an ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning the regulation of site design standards for site grading, retaining walls, and stormwater facilities, and asks for the staff report.
Thank you. So this one I do have a few slides for because I think there's some images that will help to explain the code amendment. Again, I like to enter into the record the case file, zoning code, and draft ordinance, as well as this presentation.
So now,
Thank you. So just a little bit of background. Again, we talked about this one in January. The zoning code does a really good job of regulating site design and building design, architecture, landscaping, lighting, sort of all of the elements, physical elements of a development site. What it doesn't really address is grading, retaining walls, and drainage facilities, which are sometimes very equally prominent physical elements of a development site. You know, we have technical standards to make sure that those elements are functional, but not those aesthetic standards. And staff actually brought this to the attention of City Council last year after we had a series of projects where, frankly, there were some substandard designs that were some more or less prominent than others that we think we could have done better with, but we didn't have the regulatory backing to ask for some updated or upgraded designs. So we talked with council last December and you all in January, and our goals for this amendment have all along to create context-sensitive designs, but nothing that's overly burdensome, overly regulatory. Is sort of our first dip into the water, if you will, in terms of creating this type of regulatory framework. So we tried to create some minimum standards, but something that's pretty reasonable. There's two sections here that you've seen, the stormwater facilities, and then we separated out grading and retaining walls. So again, most of you know this because you see some development proposals, but for the most part, almost any site that's more than a single family or duplex will require some sort of stormwater facility. So if you have more than 3,000 square feet of impervious area, you have to provide water quality features. If you exceed 10,000 square feet in impervious area, you're also providing detention facilities. And those are the facilities that we usually see above ground in some sort of pond or basin. Sometimes when a site is pretty constrained, it'll get vaulted underground, but they're often above ground. And as I mentioned, we have those technical requirements to make sure they function, that they're appropriately sized, but not a lot in terms of design. And we see the whole range from just sort of a grassy depression that functions as a pond, they're usually dry most of the time, to sort of this empty concrete swimming pool, if you will, that's just sort of waiting to be filled up. But they're not, you know, they're more or less integrated with the rest of the design of the site. So there's really only 5 design standards that this ordinance proposes, and they're summarized here and they were in your code. I won't belabor that. The word visible is underlined here because based on the January discussion, we incorporated the commission's recommendation to have the design upgrades for concrete structures really only apply when those structures are visible from a public street or public space. So that seemed very reasonable. And again, just because these types of designs are sometimes hard to picture. In this example, you see a concrete channel that would convey water, but is a pretty stark contrast to the natural features of this, green lawn and the trees. Our code would encourage to have a little bit more planting or rock or something to make that concrete channel a little bit more complementary to the area. And one other example I have, so this is pretty stark, but not too uncommon, where you see the detention pond really just be those plain concrete walls that have been formed, but no surface treatment. It's not a lot of added expense or burden to just do a stamped concrete or put a veneer, or in this case, you can see there's some application of stone, there's some natural grasses in there, and a few trees planted at the top of the embankment. So, I think the two designs I've given as the pro designs are really on the far extreme of very highly upgraded. We're leaving a little bit of gray area in the code, but at least it gives us a backing to ask for a little bit more when we see something substandard. In terms of grading and walls, again, just 4 provisions for each respectively. That 8th provision is underlined because that too came out of the discussion in January in terms of sort of maintenance and feasibility, and so we're restricting turf from being planted on steeper slopes, or slopes that are steeper than 4 to 1. And again, just a couple of images that I think we will be incorporating into our design guidebook that supplements the code, because I think it really helps to give our applicants a sense of what we're seeking. In this example, you see a sort of excessively tall retaining wall right next to a sidewalk, so it's not a very comfortable environment. And the code that we're proposing would encourage incorporation of terracing or landscaping to make that feel a little bit more comfortable, particularly against a public space or public sidewalk. And one more example for something that's a little harder. I struggle with this too sometimes. When we look at a grading plan, it's two-dimensional. We're trying to interpret what that will look like in 3D on a site. Rolling versus straight slopes is something that we'll be emphasizing, so it feels a little bit more natural here on the left side of the slide versus something that's more man-made sort of feature. So the hope being that it integrates a little bit more with existing topography or sort of adjacent sites or features that are already on a property. As I mentioned, these provisions would be codified into the zoning code, which is a very text-heavy document. It doesn't support pictures very well, so we will also be including the provisions and photographs in the architectural and site design manual, which is sort of a freestanding guidebook that we provide to applicants. So we are recommending approval of this ordinance, and I should have mentioned earlier, the alcohol production and this grading ordinance will both go to City Council on April 10th for a public hearing.
Thank you. Let's hear from the commissioners. Commissioner Bowden. Commissioner Dorsey. No. Commissioner Kimsey. Commissioner Voss.
Yes. I had a couple of questions that are more to this whole subject and not so much the code, just trying to catch up a little bit. The ponds that you're talking about, are they adjacent to the impervious surface so that that's what catches the runoff?
Yes, so typically what we see is that you hope for a site that has a little bit of slope and it's on the downhill side of that property. So, depending on the topography of the site, the downhill side could be in the back and not very visible, or it could be in the front and, very visible. So it doesn't have to be immediately adjacent to the impervious surface, but they have to provide a drainage report that explains how the water is conveyed to the pond if it's not immediately adjacent.
Okay, and then a couple more. Do you get to view the developer's plans for, once that passes and moves forward, do you get to view the developer's plans for these grading and landscaping? Yes.
Yeah, so depending on the zoning and the type of the development, at some point we will always see a site plan, building elevations, landscape. We'd now require specific grading plans. We'd require details that show sort of what the walls might look like, or what sort of above grade ponds might look like. Up till now, it's been very technical documents that go just really to Public Works, but we'll require that we see some of those details.
And one last question. You mentioned in the background a series of new development projects with substandard designs. Will those be left alone per this code? Nothing gets upgraded?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's not any provision to retroactively request that they upgrade. We've been making a new effort to make sure that people are maintaining their landscaping, so what little they may have, we'll be encouraging that that happens. We have a landscape inspection program that will be starting this year. It's sort of a proactive process, but we won't be applying these specific standards to them.
Thank you.
Commissioner Leo? I got a couple questions. First, thank you for going through this and letting us add some input to it. So I've read through it, and I'm very familiar with the stormwater and the detention. One of the questions I have is there a max wall height?
It sort of depends on the application. I mean, we do, in our fence standards, where a wall is serving a divisional purpose, the maximum height is generally 4 to 6 feet, depending on where it is on the property. If it's required because of the topography of the site, that sort of trumps our maximum heights. If it's functioning more like a building, then we may apply setbacks to it. So it kind of depends on the situation.
Okay. And then do you allow walls placed on all, like say a detention is square, do you allow walls on all 4 sides?
Do we allow walls on all 4 sides of a detention facility?
Yes.
I don't think I'm not aware of anything that prohibits that. You mean like in the example where there was that, like something like this, where there's walls on?
Well, I'm thinking of a much, much larger project. But depending on the height, if there's not a max wall height and you allow walls on 4 sides, what could that potentially look like? I know that you say terrace is encouraged, but typically what I see is, and it depends on the municipality, but I typically see a 4-foot height, so then you have to terrace. And some municipalities have a 50% max, meaning 2 sides. You can only do 2 sides with retaining walls. And the reason is there's, my understanding is there's been a recent tragedy, maybe within the last year, where an individual went into a detention and had walls on 4 sides. The walls were steep, and that individual couldn't climb out. Now, typically, there's usually a maintenance path, but depending on how large the detention is, I just wanted to see if that was something that was, if that was an issue that was ever brought up.
Not something that's ever come to my attention. I mean, I haven't up till now been very involved in reviewing drainage facilities. I know we follow urban drainage best practice guidelines, so I don't know if that's in there as a guideline, which, isn't obviously a regulation, but certainly something to be aware of. I hadn't thought of that type of scenario before.
Okay. There is no one in the audience, so we will close the citizens forum. And I guess at this point I would entertain a motion from the commissioners.
I move to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning the regulation of site design standards for site grading, retaining walls, and stormwater facilities.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Do we need to add the exhibits on the other page after the motion?
No, that's
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there any discussion from the commissioners? Yeah, my only comment is I would just like staff to to consider some of those last comments I made, purely from just kind of a life safety. And flexibility is fine, but just to kind of have that general understanding.
Sure.
Let's call for a vote.
Motion carried 6-0.
Thank you. We are now on to other items, the election of officers.
Yes, so every year, per the Planning Commission's bylaws, you elect new officers, and we have traditionally done that by secret ballot. So you should have received 2 small pieces of paper. You lost yours. We have extra. So just write down on one piece of paper who your vote would be for chair. It can be anybody present or not present. And then pass them down to Tammy, and then we'll sort of repeat the process for vice chair. Any questions? Yes.
Not having done this before, what are the, not qualifications, what are the duties of each of these?
That's a good question. Scott, do you want to address the duties of chair?
Yeah, I think the short answer is you run the meeting, but you need to go through a careful schedule of what comes first in a certain order, and then just need to be, let everybody kind of have their voice while not letting people talk too long, and just run a fair meeting.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good answer. And the vice chair, I think the main responsibility is to act as chair when the chair's absent. Yeah, so we follow Robert's Rules of Order, same as the city council. So it's really the meeting facilitator and keeping each other in order. And the only thing that you can't do as chair is make a motion.
And we don't have any idea of if the commissioners actually want these positions, so we vote for the positions for individuals who may not necessarily want them.
That's correct.
Okay, just making sure.
You can just put one name for now. We'll vote for chair first, and then that will at least take one person out of the running, and then we'll do the second one in a minute. So hand one name down to Tammy, towards Tammy.
That's for chair. We're voting on chair right now. We're handing it to Tammy. Yep. He had mine. That's why.
Is that how you lose out on the vote, though, if you're not here?
It's just checking the bylaws, held by secret ballot without nomination. So we're doing it correctly.
So there are, and what are the bylaws again about the persons that have been past chair, or past vice chair?
That's a good question.
So Scott, you've been reelected. You got 3 votes.
Okay. Sounds good.
And then vice chair is your next vote.
Did she lose it? Do you need another piece?
Where went?
Extra?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Dirk, you're our vice chair. You won 4 votes.
All right. So you can enjoy your positions for this calendar year. The only other updates we have, there won't be the first meeting in April. So April 6th will be canceled, right? We may very likely have cases ready for April 20th. And just a little staffing update, you may see new face. Scott Cutler is our new planner technician who just started last week. He's been here almost 2 weeks. He offered to come tonight, but I told him he didn't have to, so, but you'll meet him soon, I'm sure. So, that's all I have.
Is there any other questions or anybody wants to discuss for other items? Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Call for vote?
Motion passed 6-0.